An illuminated initial is an enlarged and decorated capital letter, the first letter of a section of text. They can vary from the basic pen and ink drawn letter to the most elaborate letter painted with gold or silver leaf. Text and illumination were complementary and were either closely related or sharply contrasted. Illuminated initials could have several purposes in medieval manuscripts. The most obvious is their decorative or aesthetic value. Initials that include human or animal figures in or around them are said to be inhabited. Others may be more abstract, incorporating geometric or interlaced designs. These are simply called decorated initials. They could also be used to illustrate the text in addition to or instead of miniatures. Historiated initials show a scene or a recognizable person that relates to the text in and around the shape of the letter. Sometimes illuminated initials contrast with the text. They might show irreverent or humorous figures and scenes. Beyond decoration and illustration, the primary role of illuminated initials was more practical. They provide a visual point of reference, marking the division of the text into books, chapters, paragraphs, and sometimes even verses. Illuminated initials can look very different from one manuscript to another, and even within the same manuscript. This may depend on several factors: when and where the manuscript was decorated, the type of manuscript and its intended use, the level of significance of the initials within a program of decoration, the importance and wealth of the person commissioning the manuscript.
And now we leave the stage, the virtual stage, to Dr. Adrienn Orosz.
Thank you so much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me with you today. And my name is Adrienn Orosz. I work as a librarian at the Institute of Ancient and Classical Studies, Harmatta János Library, at the Faculty of Humanities of the Eötvös Loránd University, Budapest. Sorry for the long name. I have a BA and an MA in Library and Information Science with a specialization in book history. And I'm a PhD student, so I'm not a doctor yet, I'm just a PhD student at the Eötvös Loránd University. The topic of my dissertation is the first temptation of Christ in the illumination of the Winchester Psalter. And my research area is the illumination of Romanesque and Gothic manuscripts from England and France, where I study scenes with the temptations of Christ, the interplay of space and time, mise, abyme, and the expression of chaos in miniatures, initials, pas-de-page ornaments, and illustrations at the margins. In my research, I combine methods and observations from codicology, religious studies, semiotics, and nonlinear dynamics. I have a special interest in the development and transmission of religious motifs. I'm a regular presenter at Hungarian and international scholarly conferences, seminars, and workshops. My last presentation took place in December 2021 at the English Perceptions of the Material Text 1300 to 1600 online symposium. And the title of my presentation was Chaos Under Control, Introduction to the Problematics of the Expression of Chaos in Medieval Manuscripts from England. I'm sharing my screen. Okay. So in the next approximately 60 minutes, I will talk about the combination of three things. One of them is initials. The initial is a letter beginning the word at the opening of a sentence, paragraph, or other section, as we heard. In the codices of the Middle Ages, the initial is often typographically distinguished. This markedness is shown by its different shape, color, and dimensions as compared to other letters in the text. It is often decorated with non-figural ornaments like linear elements, patches, floral motifs, or figures of animals, humans, and fantastic beings. It is also frequently adorned with scenes from the stories of the Bible. The other thing I will tell you about is space. As time might be regarded as an aspect of space, I will handle them both. We will see what are the characteristics of space in religious manuscripts, and we'll mull over what borders are used for, why illuminators freed space, or why they broke it to pieces. The third thing in my presentation is a fight which was thought to be the most important one in human history, the fight between good and evil. This struggle is fought since immemorial times and will continue until the last breath of existence, and it is fought for our souls. Now then, what is the topic of today? What connects the dots? I will talk about the most condensed sign ever made, one single letter containing the fate of the universe. That is the initial decorated with scenes from the story of salvation in Romanesque and Gothic manuscripts from England. In order to create such signs, a specific tool is used, which is called the mise, abyme, a mirror which links the beginning and the end of a story in a special bond, a bond which can shape narrative, space, and time at its whim. It may occur in miniatures of manuscripts, but if put into an initial, we receive an emblem and a symbol. In order to better understand that, I dedicate the first part of my paper to initials and will show how they handle space and narrative. In the second part, I will explain the concept of the mise, abyme. We will also look at examples when initials show mise, abyme characteristics. The third part will be a case study in which I explain the development of a specific motif, namely initials decorated with scenes from the Triple Temptation, showing you the 5 stages leading to the formation of this peculiar sign, and we'll also speculate on the 6th stage and how it could look like. We will begin with some basic matters and we'll proceed step by step so that in the end, we are able to free space, bend time, smash the space into pieces through the introduction of second timeline, and we'll also speculate on its opposite, all within initials. There are mainly 2 types of letters in medieval codices, those constituting the body of the text itself and initials. In Romanesque and Gothic manuscripts from England, letters of the main text were mostly written in black or brown color, but there are parts which might be of other colors, such as red, green, or blue. In the Winchester Psalter on the slide, and in psalters in general, they are typically, but not exclusively, placed in the calendar section at the beginning of the book. Also, longer sections consisting of more sentences could be typographically marked, as in the case of incipits and explicits in the various books in the Bibles. This means that not only initials were typographically distinguished and marked. As for the initials, that is the letter beginning the word at the opening of a sentence, paragraph, or other section, they might or might not be distinguished. It depended on the budget of the commissioner of the codex, the nature, content, and purpose of the book, and the placement of the initials within the text. In psalters, we might observe that the opening letter of verses could be typographically marked. These initials were bigger than other letters and were worked out with more care in detail. They might have been of the same color as the text, but could also be of a different color. Another type of initials was ornamented with lines and non-figurative elements. These could be placed at the beginning of songs. Psalters in the year in question had 3-fold, 8-fold, or 10-fold division in England. These systems ran parallelly and could also be combined. At the opening of psalms, of the divisions were singled out with decorative ornaments. Most of our examples throughout the presentation come from such section opening initials. They were adorned with floral elements, animal motifs, and sometimes all psalms could have more or less ornamented initials in the book. Inhabited initials were adorned also with monsters, as well as humans trapped in vast forests of tendrils of plants. Historiated initials, on the other hand, depicted identifiable figures and specific scenes, often from stories of the Bible. It was the first psalm, Beatus Vir, which was the most flourishly decorated historiated initial in earlier manuscripts, often depicting scenes from the life of David and Christ, sometimes occupying the whole page, like in the Psalter of the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek on the slide. This and other opening psalms of other divisions could even own miniatures introducing them. If we consider initials as borders and frames of a given psalm, then initials having an own frame or an introduction in the form of a miniature might be an example to the phenomenon known as the double frame. But let's not proceed so fast. Let's turn our attention instead to the space as arranged within the initial. The division of space within the initial is closely related to the shape of the letter it adorns. This also points to letters which were, so to say, predestined to be illuminated, like letter O, and letters for the illumination of which more guile was needed from the part of the illuminator if he or she wanted to decorate it with scenes, like letter A. The most favored letters for illumination had undivided space in the inside and were closed like letter Q, D, and O, or were open like C, U, L, and V. In case of letters B, B, and R, which had both a loop and a stem, the loop could be decorated with the scene and the stem with floral motifs, monsters like dragons or snakes, or humans. Here, as the loop was little, it was more challenging for the artists. Letters with double loops divided space inherently, and thus letter S, H, E, and B again could contain not only one, but two scenes, and this was often exploited. The question arises now, on what principle were scenes combined within a letter, and how much did the illuminators conform the decoration to the natural shape and division of the space within the initial? Did they alter space? And if yes, what were their motives behind? As many of the topics and scenes within historiated initials originate from miniatures, in order to understand the initials, we have to know the basic rules and principles of reading miniatures. The main direction of reading the text was from left to right and from top to bottom. So, for example, in this excerpt of a cutting of miniatures from illuminated manuscripts in the British Library, the scenes from the Temptations of Christ follow each other in a linear chronological order from left to right, from the first to the third episode. This reading was used in the initials as well, but only rarely, as the division of space within the letter was more suitable for a reading from top to bottom because of the shape of the letters, mainly S, H, E, and B. Most reading directions are present in the miniature of the Winchester Psalter, where we see the three temptations divided into two registers, the first two episodes in the upper register and the third one beneath. For reading from top to bottom in an initial, we need letters the shape of which contains an inner border or dividing line, like letters S, H, E, or B. In the Winchester Bible, letter E shows scenes from the story of Joshua, God's charge to Joshua in the upper register, and Joshua speaking to his officers in the lower register. This horizontal division of space copies the division of miniatures into the letter and makes two registers in it. Let's see now some exceptions. First, I bring an example to the artificial division of space, that is, when the illuminator broke space into pieces with the deliberate introduction of an artificial inner border within the initial. This technique made possible, in case of letter D in the York Psalter, to read the story from left to right, just like in the case of miniatures or writing. This historiated initial on the slide of Psalm 101 depicts Judith praying at the left side, and after the column of the ark, we see the next scene, Judith handing the head of Holofernes to the maid. The linearity of reading is thus preserved also in the initial, and the scenes of the story follow each other in a chronological order. The second example is from the Bohème Psalter, where the initial shows the opposite of this technique. The first temptation of Christ in letter B deletes the inner horizontal border of the letter and thus unites the originally divided space in order to gain more room for the illustration of the story. Not only the division of space could be changed in the initial at the will of the illuminator, but also the direction of reading. However, to see a change in the direction of reading in case of images, we need at least 3 scenes, because when 2 episodes were available only, the order of the scenes regularly followed the traditional way of reading. In a miniature, this interesting method of reading is seen on the creation of the world in the already shown psalter from the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. The 6 days of creation are divided into 6 medallions. In the first 2 above, the narrative proceeds from left to right. Then we go down, and there the 3rd day is at the right and the 4th at the left. That is, here the scenes are to be read in the opposite direction. And then below day 5 and 6 again are to be read from left to right. More such tricks were brought to England in the early Gothic period during the 13th century, when the reading habits of psalters, often with added canticles and hours, laid more emphasis on the contemplative nature of reading, and thus unusual pictorial solutions and puzzles were introduced into the illumination of the otherwise familiar scenes. However, in case of historiated initials, it was not easy to reproduce this new technique of illustration because of the more moderate size of the letter and the natural division of its inner space. Nevertheless, I will show you one specific example for that in the case study later in my presentation. After discussing the basic characteristics of space within historiated initials, the question is now, what scenes were combined in an initial and through what means and methods? The analyzed examples were episodes from the narrative of the same story, placed in a chronological order, read from top to bottom and from left to right. However, many times the images and the loops of the letters combined different stories, one from the Old Testament and another from the New Testament. These biblical stories are mainly concerned with the events from the life of 2 figures, David and Christ. The background of this is twofold. First, the New Testament did not contain any prayer book, unlike the Old Testament, which had the book of Psalms. Thus, Christianity reinterpreted the content of the Psalms and gave them a secondary meaning corresponding to the episodes of the life of Christ. Sentences with these correspondences were given in the beginning of the Psalms and were called tituli. In English psalters, these tituli appeared in a form of a written list in the preface of the book, or in luxury psalters in the form of miniatures as a prefatory cycle with scenes from the public life of Christ. That is, Psalms had 2 readings, and thus in the initials, often 2 or more episodes were combined, mostly from the life of David and the life of Christ. The second reason for connecting these 2 figures was the similarity between their lives. Both David and Christ fought with the evil during their lives, and both were highly esteemed in Christianity. To mention some examples, the first psalm in the Winchester Bible on the slide in 2 columns is decorated with scenes from the life of David on the left. In the upper loop of letter B, we see David fighting with a bear who attacked his flock, and below with a lion. In the second initial, on the right, similar fights with evil forces are depicted, now from the life of Christ. In the upper part, there is an exorcism scene, and below, the harrowing of hell. In the York Psalter, the initial of letter D at Psalm 52 about fools and foolishness combines again scenes around this topic from the life of Christ in the upper register and from the life of David below. We see the Jews as stoning Christ and David with the fool. Again in the York Psalter, In this wonderful decoration of initial S at Psalm 68, the motive of the deliverance is depicted, but this time not David but Jonah is brought next to Christ. Above we see the resurrection from the tomb with Christ between two angels, while below Jonah is depicted as just being delivered from the belly of the whale. Our next example is an exceptional initial illuminated with no less than 4 beautifully painted scenes. Initial D of Psalm 26 from the same Psalter is decorated with 2 episodes from the life of David and Christ, respectively. On the left, in the upper part, we see Samuel anointing David, with the presentation of Christ on the right. And below, on the left, the illuminator portrayed the coronation of David, while on the right, we see the baptism of Christ. The scenes on these examples were combined based on 1 or 2 metaphors. The metaphor serves as a common denominator of two or more images in the initial, showing how the episodes of the different stories that for first do not seem alike are similar after all. The other method of connecting the scenes is metonymy. Here the connection functions based on association or contiguity. Some objects present and relevant on both scenes might serve as a conceptual metonymy in the illumination of the initial. For example, in the initial on the slide, it is not only metaphor that connects the scenes based on their content, but metonymy as well in the form of liquids. In the case of David, it is oil, and in the images of Christ, water. Another method to connect the scenes, indexicality, will be shown on the next 2 initials. In the initial of the Dus manuscripts from the Bodleian library, the trumpet serves to pointing and connecting also figuratively the 2 scenes, which are otherwise connected through a metaphor as well. And the ladder in the York Psalter focuses attention and connects the scene of the harping David with that of the dream of Jacob. As the examples show, in one set of scenes in an initial, also more connecting methods might be present, so that it is easier to understand why stories with different participants in different places and times were combined in the illumination of a given initial. However, linking stories from the Old Testament with the New Testament, which represent distant points in time in the perennial fight between good and evil, is a typical function of the mise, abyme tool. Let me turn to that now. The term mise, abyme, placed into abyss, was first used and described by André Gide in his journal in 1893. Under this term, taken from visual arts, he described an internal application of the theme of a work of art, such as the object depicted within itself. Later, this definition was found insufficient by other researchers to explain what the phenomenon is exactly about. Nevertheless, Gide took the analogy from heraldry, where one coat of arms subsumes a second at heart point. Gide applied this concept not only to visual arts, though, but also to literature. The monograph and articles of Lucien Dellenbach analyze in detail and with many examples the phenomenon in literature. Other authors who contributed much to the describing of this phenomenon include Jean Ricardot, Mieke Ball, Moshe Ron, and Ken R. Ireland, among others. It is agreed that using the concept of Gérard Genette, autotextuality manifests itself in the mise, abyme. Autotextuality is how a text reflects to itself. It is thus, according to Linda Hutchon, a narcissistic characteristic of text, like quotation and internal resume. According to Lucien Dellenbach, mise, abyme is an internal mirror reflecting the narrative as a whole by simple, repeated, or specious duplication. For him, specious duplication is a fragment supposed to include the work which includes it. Moshe Ron, on the other hand, defines it as an iconic figure peculiar to narrative, and he thinks that any diegetic segment that is, any bit of the narrated story or represented world which resembles the work where it occurs, is said to be placed on a beam. The resembling diegetic segment, though, must be considerably smaller in textual extension than the work it resembles to, and it should not be located at a higher diegetic level than that. It is a metalinguistic code as it compresses and records the content of the work. It is a repetition within the work, and thus it strengthens the structure of the work, enhances the operation of its significance, lets the work enter into dialogue with itself, and creates the scope of the self-interpretative apparatus. Its efficiency depends on the quality of the analogy between the reflected and the reflecting text, and on its syntagmatic parameter, that is, the place of the resembling diegetic segment within the narrative chain. Like synecdoches, mise en abyme can be grouped to those which restrict, that is, they suppress and narrow the meaning of the fiction, and those which generalize, that is, they extend the semantic scope of the context in a way that would be impossible otherwise. According to their position within the narrative chain, three types are distinguished. The first is the prospective mise en abyme, or programmatic bonds, placed at the beginning of the narrative, which reveals the way of reading and the program of the story in advance, like a promise, having an intriguing effect to make the reader curious and setting up expectations, serving as a model for hypotheses about the totality of the story. The second is the retrospective, or coda, placed at the end of the narrative, which reflects the story as it already happened, and as a summary relates back to the beginning, thus helping the understanding and the stronger closure of the story with elevating it to a symbol. The third one, the retroprospective mise en abyme, or axis, placed at the middle of the narrative, reflects upon preceding parts and also reveals subsequent parts of the story. This is the strongest in effect, revealing the higher structure of the narrative. As it is an iconic sign, when we look to how the reflection is actually accomplished, we must follow the tripartite classification of the relation between iconic signs and their reference. The first group is thus the topological icon, which has a spatial or pictorial relation to its object. The second group is the diagrammatic icon, where the resemblance lies in a relation between the constituents of the sign and those of its reference. Metaphorical icons, our last group, involve two references, one mediating the other. As the mise en abyme itself requires space as well, and it is placed somewhere within the story, it also interrupts the continuity of the narrative course of events, thus dividing the story itself into two parts if placed not exactly at the beginning or the end of the story. Mise en abyme, however, might also occur more times in the narrative chain. Hence, the recurring resembling diegetic segment may work as a leitmotif of the story. In form, it may exactly repeat itself, or it may take other forms as means serving its purpose, taking upon itself the peculiarities of refrains in extreme cases and having an integrative effect. As it simplifies the complexity of the original work, the resembling diegetic segment converts time to space and succession to simultaneity, and thus either helps the understanding of the original work or just on the contrary, makes it more difficult, like a dark mirror. Thus, the occurrence of mise en abyme can either contest or reveal the proper functioning of a particular narrative. As Rob writes, in a story which desires to remain incomplete, mise en abyme may find its contestation specified as a power to reveal. End of quote. It subverts the representational intent of the narrative text, disrupting where the text aspires to integration, integrating where the text is deliberately fragmentary. Narrative is a characteristic of both pictorial and written text, and though mise en abyme comes from the visual arts, it seems that literature contributed more to its history of research, methodology, and theoretical elaboration. Can we apply then these methods and results to codicology? Let's take an example so that we may test it. A clear example for a mise en abyme initial is found in a French psautier Boulogne-sur-Mer BM20, now in the collection of the Abbey of Saint Bertin in Saint-Omer. The lavishly decorated codex was made in 999 and contains initials decorated with non-figurative floral and animal motifs, as well as historiated initials with scenes of stories from the Bible. At Psalm 90, the initial of letter Q has an extraordinary ornamentation. The motif is the first temptation of Christ, in which we see the devil offering stones to the fasting Son of God and tries to persuade him to turn them into bread. The connection between the image and the psalm is a metaphor and a multi-layered metonymy. It is a metaphor as referring to the holy protection the believers are given against the temptations and actions of the devil in their lives through the help of God and Son of God, as in the text of the psalm and the example of the picture, who could ward off the devil. And it is a triple metonymy, a textual and a double pictorial one. As a textual metonymy, verses 11 and 12 of Psalm 90 are directly quoted by the devil in the story of the triple temptation in the second episode, which connects thus the two stories. It is also a pictorial metonymy because of the stones which are present both in the text and in the illumination of the initial. Thus, this prayer in the Old Testament receives an actualization and reinterpretation based on the life of Christ in the New Testament, linking two distant times at the beginning of the psalm. This actualization is the fulfillment of the promise, the coming of Christ, that is, a mise en abyme based on a metaphor. This is how the image becomes the symbol of the whole psalm as a self-reflection of a psalm and also of its role within the book of Psalms, and the function of the book of Psalms themselves as a self-reflection of the book of Psalms. Psalters and the continuous praying of Psalms were sought to help against the temptations of daily life, and thus psalters were thought of as a sort of weapon against the devil. However, this initial is even a more complex mise en abyme, which makes it unique. How? Let's focus on what is under the feet of Christ. On the left, there is a lion, and on the right, a dragon. This is Christus super aspidem. These animals are mentioned explicitly in the text of the psalm in verse 13, thus this is the third metonymical link between the image and the text, again a pictorial one. And in the same time, these animals create also a mise en abyme, based again on a metaphor, but on the third and fourth level now. The third level is the self-reflection of the story of the triple temptation to itself. In the first episode of the fight between good and evil, we see the end of the narrative of the temptations of Christ. And in the same time, we also see its ultimate outcome, the triumph of Christ over the forces of the devil in the story of salvation, a self-reflection on the fourth level. This is what the reader of the Psalter shall never forget. Temptations and probes in his or her life will have a similar favorable end. Placed in the beginning of a psalm, within its frame in the initial, it is a prospective mise en abyme, while as placed at the beginning of Psalm 90 on folio 101 from the total of 231 folios of the manuscripts, it is situated at around the middle of the book and thus functions as a retroprospective type as well. That is, this initial represents different types of mise en abîmes on the different levels of the work, as the text reflects itself both as a psalm, as a psalter, as the story of the temptations of Christ, and as the story of salvation. All four mise en abîmes extend the semantic scope of the context and thus generalize and make the text they illustrate timeless and mythical. We were therefore able to apply the principles and observations of the literary type of mise en abyme in our study concerning initials, and this made possible for us to model and describe how a single letter becomes a very condensed sign. After this initial from a French manuscript, let's see how English manuscripts used the letter as an abyme, as now I'm about to show you two other examples in more details. In this part, I will show you how the aforedetailed background might be used in practice in the analysis of a particular motif, the temptations of Christ. As I have a special interest in the different aspects of space, such as chaotic space, movements in space, and the relation of space and time, space will be in the focus of the next 30 minutes beside mise en abyme and initials. First, let's turn to the story of the triple temptation and the poetical expression of speciality in the text. The temptations of Christ is reported by three evangelists in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew records the events as quoted on the slide. When Jesus is fasting in the wilderness, the devil comes and tempts him 3 times. First, he offers him stones and tells him to turn them to bread in order to appease his hunger. Jesus refuses him, quoting from the scriptures. Then the devil takes him to Jerusalem and has him stand on the pinnacle of the temple. He asks him to jump down, saying that as the Son of God, he will not be harmed. Again, Jesus resists the temptation. Then the devil brings him to a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world, offering them to him, should he choose to serve him. Jesus refuses the offer of the devil, who leaves the scene. Angels come then to Jesus and serve him. I made a summary of the main actions of the plot, showing the differences between the narrative sequences in the works of the 3 authors. In the present paper, we will follow the account of Matthew. What references do we have in the story regarding space? For the analysis of the literary and artistic texts in this regard, I turn to semiotics again, just like in the case of mise en abyme, and apply the principles and methods outlined by Yuri Lotman, Boris Uspensky, Mika Bal, and others. The 3 biblical accounts hold the same temporal and spatial position as the characters within the story, since the narrator, as an invisible companion, joins the characters in real time from scene to scene, reporting the events from the inside. The storyline is arranged temporally into a sequence, one scene following the other. The beginning of the story takes us to the wilderness, an open, dangerous place full of wild animals. It is a low place lying somewhere outside, as the movement of Jesus and the devil is directed outwards from their previous position. Jesus is tempting through his physiological needs as an ordinary human. Then they move together inwards to the city of Jerusalem, a dense and much safer place than the preceding one. The devil takes Jesus upwards to the rooftop of the temple, high above the city, from where they have a bird's eye view. Here, Jesus' quality as a believer is tested. The last temptation takes us again outwards and also upwards to the highest place imaginable, to the peak of a mountain, where the openness is so wide that it gives a sense of being outside of the world, free from its spatio-temporal constraints, seeing its totality from above, independent from space and time. Here, Jesus is tempted as the Son of God. The end of the story for Luke is Jesus' rejection of the offer of the devil and the subsequent retreat of the latter, but we have an extra scene in the versions of Matthew and Mark showing angels attending Jesus. To sum up, on the vertical axis, the story begins in a low place, and through movements upwards to higher places, ends up in the highest place possible, displaying the totality of the world. In the same time, on the horizontal axis, we see a pulsing shift back and forth between open and dense places. As for the change in the status of the characters, The first direct battle between good and evil begins with Jesus as an ordinary Son of Man and ends with his elevation of state, showing the devil retreating and, as per the record of Matthew and Mark, revealing the supernatural position of Jesus, showing angels serving to him. Let's see now how the narrative spatial relations are expressed on temptation scenes in the iconographic program of Romanesque codices from England, representing stage 1. In manuscripts illustrating all the 3 temptations, the pictures are arranged into distinct whole-page miniatures in a chronological order, or placed to 1, 2, or 3 registers to be read from left to right and from top to bottom. The pictures are separated from each other by some sort of an inner boundary represented by an organic element or a frame. In the Winchester Psalter on the left side of the slide, the speciality of the story is well built into the artistic arrangement of the page, while in the Canterbury Psalter on the right, we find an example displaying the closing scene as well, with the angels attending the Son of God in the bottom right corner of the slide. In the early Gothic period, however, the usual method of illustration changes. In a Psalter from 1190, now in the possession of the Leiden University Library, there is a whole-page miniature without any inner boundaries. The scenes do not follow the usual linear order from left to right and from top to bottom. The first temptation is situated on the bottom left. The second temptation follows on the right and brings us up to the last temptation on the top left of the page. Practically speaking, we deal with 2 registers here, but without any explicitly expressed separating boundaries. What we see here is the complete reorganization of the usual order of the scenes. Instead of adhering to the linear structure of the narrative, its artistic mise-en-page thrusts into prominence a new principle, the spatial characteristics of the story. Using the analogy of the Cartesian grid, where let's say axis X represents time and axis Y represents space, axis Y is now liberated from its relation with X and is completely set free according to the spatial characteristics of the story. The change of axis Y means, in the same time, that axis X, standing for time, cannot play its function as a straight line anymore. It is reconstructed according to the changes and takes the shape of a circle, extending the original 2-dimensional linear storytelling to a 3-dimensional one on the page, where space literally bends time and displays space as the fundamental component. The first temptation takes place on a low setting outside of any inhabited place. The third one, again, outside the city, but on a high place set over the plane on the picture, because of its similarly situated but different vertical quality. The second temptation is also located on an elevated place, and the character appearing on the same level as the peak of the mountain is shown on the left side, showing both places equally high. This is stage 2 in the special reorganization of the pictorial representation of the temptation story. Stage 3 can be found on a miniature of another psalter made in Oxford a few decades later and housed now in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. Here, the line of time, originally axis X, is perfectly curved. We have 3 levels now for the 3 scenes without the trace of registers or the like. The inner boundaries are expressed only by the scrolls summarizing the dialogue between Jesus and the devil. The first temptation is put to the lower right corner. The second temptation is in the middle, covering the whole height of the page, with Jesus and the devil on the upper half of it. The angels, mentioned in this episode but actually appearing only at the end of the text, are shown now on the side of Christ. The last temptation is put on the left side to middle level. This arrangement, however, challenges the loyalty in following the spatial aspects of the details in the story. It is clearly based on the new spatial organizing principle, but also violates it, as the peak of the mountain ought to be at least as high as the top of the Temple of Jerusalem, as in stage 2, if not higher, contrary to the representation of the picture. The angels placed now at the second temptation again strengthen the assumption that there must be something more to it than the perfection of visualization of the spatial artistic principle. The story is recreated through the hierarchical arrangement of a new principle. The new principle surfacing here is the theological aspect of space in which the sacred exercises dominion over the liminal space. I suggest now to meditate a bit on the concept of space from a theological point of view. In the Middle Ages, the Christian approach distinguished different types of spaces. The world as created by God was thought of what we could call now the cosmic space, the totality made according to the divine order established by the word of God. It contains sacred space, liminal space, and to a limited extent, also chaotic space. We may call sacred space the places like cities, temples, houses, the human body, and especially the human heart. All of them have a distinct boundary separating them from other places. These places are unlike natural places. They have to be chosen, conquered, and held, and they represent the sacred order, a basic principle along which the original space gets reorganized. Liminal space, on the other hand, is present at places where this consecration does not take place, that is, outside of the city, the temple, the body, and the heart. Chaotic space, in its clearest form, does not exist within the Christian way of thinking, as we shall not forget that even the fallen angel Lucifer is the creation of God, and as such is part of the cosmos. But what does all this have to do with our picture? Should we approach stage 3 keeping this information in mind, we might catch the organizing principle of the space on our picture. The first temptation in the desert, where the devil approaches Jesus, represents the liminal space. The second temptation takes place in a sacred setting at the temple of the holy city. The third temptation at the top of a mountain takes us to cosmic space from where the totality of the created world can be seen. That being so, each temptation symbolizes a different theological aspect of space, organized not only as per their vertically and horizontally exhibited spatial characteristics, but also according to the hierarchy of their divine attributes. This is why the second temptation, we see the second temptation representing the sacred plane exercising supremacy over the whole composition in the middle of the picture as the highest place instead of the third temptation, which should be the highest point if strictly following the vertical characterization of the story. This is why the second temptation is strengthened also by the appearance of the angels, who originally do not appear at this episode of the story, only later. And this is why the liminal space is shown at the lowest point of the composition, squeezed into a bottom corner. This is also why the third temptation is shown located between the levels of the liminal and the sacred space. The straight line of the temporal axis is bent now to a perfect circle. This religious spatial organizing principle was used by the illuminator when he or she illustrated the story of the triple temptation. But is it easy to understand the episodes of the story if we base it on the way of execution of the illumination? Certainly not. Even if the reader, a monk or a Christian dignitary commissioning the preparation of the codex was familiar with the plot, the artistic composition creates a conflict between the temporality of the events in the plot and their visual representation, and makes the reader take a pause to decipher the succession of the episodes. Without doubt, all Christian readers could understand what story the picture was talking about. But to many, the order of the scenes might have been confusing. Where to begin the reading of the picture? And where does it end? What is more, does it actually have a beginning and an ending at all? The eyes of the reader used to the visualization of the narrative, as from left to right and from top to bottom, are now disoriented, as the new principle was not used for any other scenes of the codex than that of the triple temptation. The codes are correct, but the relationship between them is missing. The reader understands the signs, but not their syntax. To decipher it, he or she enters semiosis, the meaning-making process, which has a temporal aspect. It requires time. With that, the illuminator deliberately stops the reader so as to make him or her reflect upon what he or she sees, hence putting a focus on this episode, on the story of salvation. The temporality of the story, instead of reflecting the succession of the episodes, expresses another level now, through which the story of salvation becomes mythical. Instead of linear time, it is put to the plane of cyclical time, showing the battle for our souls as ever recurring through countless millennia of time until the second coming of Christ. The cyclical arrangement of the episodes expresses now both the spatiality and the temporality of the story, elevating it to an eternal symbol frozen in its infinity, detached from human space and time. With this, we reach our first initial now, in stage 4, after 1250, when the new concept appears in the decoration of an initial in the Manuscripts altar. The new concept flourishes because it is stage 3 that functions as the prototype of the initial on our slide. The whole story is used as a symbol taken out from among the miniatures and put in the illumination of letter D, beginning Psalm 52. With this step, the composition is made more abstract and it assumes an emblematic quality, a mise, abyme. The triple temptation as an emblem now symbolizes not only the temptation story, it refers to the whole contest between good and evil. All the inner boundaries are deleted now. There is no scroll as before or whatever separating Jesus from the devil. The figure of Jesus is shown in the middle. The devil is pushed out to the edges and is not depicted as a whole figure, but only in a partial shape. The eternal battle between good and evil is put now into one single letter. Can there any sign be more compressed than this picture? The answer is yes. To create the most condensed sign ever made, another artistic technique is needed, breaking up space into pieces in order to combine two stories. In initial Q at the beginning of Psalm 51 in the Eötvös Psalter, made at around 1260, the illuminator shatters space by introducing or forcing back an inner boundary clearly for the sake of the illustration, as the shape of the letter does not require the division of space. The second temptation is depicted at the upper part of the letter. Now, evidently, this is the most important scene of the story of the triple temptation, as this episode is chosen to stand for the whole story. It is placed to the upper part of the letter, dominating it due to its vertical spatial quality. Below, we find the scene from the fight of David and Goliath. David, with two soldiers behind him, stands in front of Goliath, depicted on the right. David has two stones in his left hand, and his right hand is empty, and is shown as if at the end of a swinging motion. The stone thrown by David and orange in color reaches the forehead of Goliath and kills him. Now, why is this scene in the lower part of letter Q? Why are these stories combined at all? In stages 2, 3, and 4, we saw that the lower part of the illustration was occupied by the first temptation, a scene in the desert. In the story of David and Goliath, again, the battle takes place in an open, uninhabited liminal place, just like that. This is the spatial synchrony between the first temptation and the story of David and Goliath. Then, in the hierarchy of the theological aspects of space, this combat scene just fits well again to be combined with the story of the temptation. This liminal place gets dominated by the sacred represented by the second temptation. We see here, thus, two stories taking place between good and evil, one from the Old Testament, the other from the New Testament. This parallel gets transformed and is now represented as two planes and two aspects of the same fight narrated in the story of salvation. As the battle is fought on two different planes between humans and between the devil and the Son of God, only the shattering of space can bring them together. The illuminator breaks every rule now to display two discrete points of two parallel lines in the same scene. Two temporal sequences of separate narratives are combined into one. By bringing them together through the breaking of space, however, the artist also shatters time. But now space and time do not move together as the relationship changes. The axis of space itself becomes the common denominator of the duplicated axis of time. Therefore, to create the most condensed line ever made, the illuminator has to discard the familiar spatio-temporal relationship of the sign and build it up on a multidimensional base. On this and the next slides, I summarize and compare the three initials analyzed in my presentation from the point of view and characteristics of mise and abyme. So let's see now what has changed since 999, our initial par excellence, in the 2.5 centuries which passed until our two initials from England in the case study. In the 13th century, mise and abyme initials had a remarkable variation as per their handling of space, so initials with divided space and thus more pictures within it were widely used. One might think then, with divided space within the initial, like in our example from the York Psalter, the layers of connection and meaning multiplied as the dialogue took place not only between two entities, namely the picture and the text, but also between the connecting principle between them, that is the metaphor within the initial linking its pictures on the one hand, and the connective principle between the initial and the text on the other. There is indeed more possibility for complex readings, but it depended on the fantasy and talent of the illuminator how much he or she exploited them. In our case, the layers of meaning in the Ormsby Psalter with the unified space were just as complex as in the York Psalter with the divided space. So as for the level of the sign, we see in the table that it is possible that the relationship of the picture within the written text, or in case of divided space between picture and picture, is in written form and in pictorial form. Pictorial form here means that the connection is displayed in the illustration, while written form occurs when the connection appears only in the written text. Metonymy, metaphor, icon may all be multi-layered signs with mise and abyme initials, and as for decorations with triple temptations, in the iconic sign, we also have to take into account the special relationship of the episodes within the temptation story, not only its reference to the psalm, the book of Psalms, and the story of salvation. I have not found convincing indices in the three initials now in question, but we have already seen examples in others in this presentation, so this should not concern ourselves. Not only the kinds of and layers of the signs, but also the types of the mise and abymes in historiated initials present in psalters as a specific type of books show the complexity of the challenge during semiosis the reader faces in a glimpse of an eye when encountering these fascinating works of art. The scene or scenes in the initial referred not only to the psalm, but also to the composition of the book of Psalms, the liturgical division of the psalms as well, and thus, as per their place, they could display prospective, retrospective, and retroprospective characteristics. In case of the triple temptation, the initial was in active dialogue with the story too, and depending on how many episodes and which episodes were presented on the picture, it could have been of prospective, retrospective, and retroprospective function. However, in the exceptional initial of the Ormsby Psalter, in which all the temptations were displayed without borders in a cyclical arrangement, the already mentioned categories were insufficient to describe the unique quality it expresses because it represents the kernel of the little story without its frames. The upper part of the artificially divided initial of the York Psalter displays another interesting peculiarity, as the scene shows the devil leaving the scene and thus embodies, according to the account of Luke, the closing section of the story and the triumph of Jesus. Now, if we outline the development of the illustration of the temptation story in Romanesque and Gothic manuscripts from England, it becomes clear that the crucial turn in the process occurs in stage 3, still among the miniatures. This is the point when the pictorial expression of the divine hierarchy of space, instead of its mere vertical aspect, joins the visualization of the already bent time. After this point, two options are possible depending on what to do with the inner boundaries of the picture. Deleting them altogether, we come to stage 4, a mise en abyme in an initial with perfectly free space and time, representing sacred space and cyclical time. But forcing them back, we reach stage 5, a mise en abyme in an initial with completely destroys spatial and temporal relations, a sign focusing on sacred space and two parallel lines of time. Whatever the choice of the illuminator, in the end, both options result in an emblem showing the perpetual battle between good and evil with an unfaltering hope in the triumph of the Son of God, delivering our souls. One question, nevertheless, still remains. Who has the last word in the playful banter of space and time? If it is possible to combine two or more temporal sequences in one letter through the breaking up of space, is it possible? And if yes, what is the pictorial expression to combine two or more different spatial events in one single point of time? Is there a sixth stage in the development of the motif? The answer is a theoretical yes, and we have already seen a comparable technique on our slides for it, although it requires explanation and conditions. The initial of the Manuscripts Psalter with the cyclical arrangement of the 3 episodes of the Triple Temptation is one possible way for the expression of different spatial events in one single point of time. Yet, 2 important modifications are needed. Arranging the episodes of the same story this way changes the succession of the episodes from succession to cyclical time and not to simultaneity. For simultaneity, therefore, the episodes need to belong to different stories. Putting the scenes from different narratives into the initial in a way similar to the Manuscripts Psalter might take us close to the solution. The other important modification is the reintroduction of inner borders, thus creating tiny little miniatures in registers, or even better, medallions. Medallions express visually more effectively the separation between the stories themselves than registers. Hence, I think they would be better for our objectives. But how often do we encounter such initials? Do we have an example, or only speculation is left to us? Interestingly enough, I have not yet seen an initial that wanted to express the prescribed joint of characteristics, and it is not surprising. Simultaneity in discrete points of time and through the combination of different locations of events are not typical in the stories of the Bible. Stories are not expressed as happening during or while, but instead before or after each other. Even when stories do happen simultaneously with each other, they are separately expressed as the narrator follows the heroes of the different stories in a linear narrative, one place with one episode after the other. In this sense, the approach of the Bible to the narrative chain, as a rule, prefers diachrony to synchrony. Miniatures with the Nativity, for example, do not show the shepherds on the fields, the Magi as yet in the east, and the newborn Christkind as combined together in one scene. Instead, the episodes are separately depicted in the sequence of miniatures. Parallel stories do exist, parallel timelines as well, but different places in a discrete point of time must be extremely rare occurrences in the decoration of historiated initials. Thus, although the concept of the doubling of space and their arrangement based on a metaphor describing their relationship in a single point of time is theoretically possible, and we might also have a presupposition regarding its pictorial mode of expression, in effect, they might occur only rarely, if ever. The reasons for that lie in the peculiarities of the manifestation of the narrative chain as characteristic to the Bible. This means then that space makes a stronger metaphoric base in the elimination of medieval liturgical books than time. According to the definition of Péter Hajdú, a narrative can be described as a cognitive process that arranges the facts of the empirical world into a structure or creates an order among or of them. This process is based on selection, hierarchy, and temporality. Mise and abyme in historiated initials, however, shapes the relationship of the selection, hierarchy, temporality as it pleases, and adds also space as a benefit from its visual characteristics. The order which results of it is the sacred order of the work Eötvös in liturgical books. Mise and abyme in purely visual art and in the form of written text in literature have more restricted possibilities to express their self-reflection because of their monomediality. The combination of written text with another media, picture, however, galvanizes the modes of expression, extends the range of instruments, and multiplies the planes of interactions and meanings, both on the level of the work and that of the sign. This is how a tiny letter in a codex, often measuring only a few centimeters on the page, an abyme in itself is able to become an extraordinarily multi-layered masterwork of art, the most complex and condensed sign ever made, comprising even the fate of the universe. Thank you for joining me in my journey through space and time among mise and abyme initials and temptation scenes.